All right, so hi again, everyone. I'm, as I mentioned earlier, postdoc at University of Michigan School of Information. And my research looks at how we can make digital platforms more privacy protective and more inclusive for users of diverse needs and experiences. And so this talk is going to be quite different from the first one. I'm going to go into a deep dive into the gig economy, which is a really interesting context that can tell us a lot about privacy. And then I'll talk a little bit about context beyond the gig economy. So we're all familiar with the gig economy, where workers do one-off tasks that are digitally mediated via apps or platforms. And these include jobs that a lot of us have used that take place offline, like ride sharing on Uber and delivery services like Grubhub or Instacart. And they also involve online jobs like crowdwork on Amazon Mechanical Turk, where workers do surveys and other types of small online tasks, and freelancing on platforms like Upwork. And one of the main appeals of these types of jobs is that they're available on demand. So workers have the flexibility to set their own working hours and to work from anywhere. But then at the same time, workers have a lot of privacy issues while doing gig work. So for example, when talking about a work platform, one gig worker said, they champion the freedom of this work, but their app is something out of an Orwellian fantasy. So I'm going to talk about why workers feel this way. But first, let's just consider what the gig economy context looks like. So workers typically don't have traditional labor protections. Their pay is fairly low, and their job often depends on customers rating and reviewing them. And so all of this leads to a power imbalance between workers and the platforms and the customers that they work for. And then because workers can work from anywhere using their devices, the boundaries between what is considered their personal lives and their work lives can also become blurred. And that can also make them vulnerable to privacy intrusions. So today I'll briefly address two big questions. One is, what are the privacy and surveillance issues in the gig economy, and how do workers navigate these? And what could privacy protective digital work platforms look like? And then I'll end by briefly considering some of the broader implications of this work in context beyond the gig economy. So to answer these questions, I'm going to draw on multiple studies I've done on the gig economy, looking at crowdwork, freelancing, ride-sharing, delivery services, and I'll draw on examples from each of these different work contexts. And these studies include interviews with 38 workers, most of whom were low income, depended on gig work for their main source of income, or were marginalized in some other way on account of being racial minorities often, or LGBTQ+. And that tends to track with broader trends in labor, where marginalized groups end up doing a lot of the more precarious, more low paid kind of work, and that ends up also being mirrored in the gig economy. And I'll also draw on work that used a large-scale content analysis of Reddit communities where workers talk about work, and ethnographic field work, where I also did my own work on 2 different platforms and recorded my observations. And I won't go into the methods or the individual studies here. Instead, I'll focus on a few key findings and takeaways. So overall, gig workers face many privacy risks. So especially when it comes to online work, workers commonly receive requests for really sensitive information. So even a photograph of their health insurance card. And they also risk having their data de-anonymized, used in unauthorized ways, and they're subject to scams and other sorts of attacks. And they also face surveillance threats from multiple sources, not just the platform companies. And we hear a lot about the platform companies in the news, but they also face threats from customers. So on the platform side, workers have concerns about platforms tracking them, collecting their data, both with permission. So for example, Upwork requesting access to a worker's privacy and surveillance settings on their computer, or without permission. So a very common thing is workers not being sure whether they're being tracked or not when they're out on a delivery and workers being upset that maybe a delivery app seems like it's tracking their location even when they've closed the app. But platforms are only one part of the surveillance story. So even in online and offline work settings, workers are also concerned about customers trying to track their activity. So on Upwork, a freelancing website, customers can see screenshots of workers' computers. And then also they're nervous about customers being able to maybe track them while they're making their deliveries, and sometimes even worried that they're tracking them before they should be able to track them through the app. So there's a lot of opaque issues that workers come up against, and then they're very unclear about what's happening. And so all of these sort of findings that like workers see customers as this key source of threat, and that this holds true across a lot of different work types, is an important first step in improving privacy on work platforms. And so what do workers do when they're faced with all of these privacy threats? So when they're economically reliant on gig work, they have to make very difficult trade-offs between earning money that they really, really need and protecting themselves against risk. And often the need for money wins. And so, for example, on Amazon Mechanical Turk that I mentioned, where crowd workers do these short online tasks for small amounts of money, a worker told me this striking story about what it was like doing this work while he was unemployed. And so he said one of the tasks that he opened up and was doing, a requester asked him to pour ketchup on his chest while lying in his bathroom. And he said, I can't imagine what that was for, and I didn't ask. And I was shocked by this, and I asked him what he did next. And he told me he actually did it. And when he told me his rationale, it made a lot of sense. So he'd been unemployed for several months. He thought about this as a cost-benefit analysis. The cleanup was easy. It only took 15 minutes. And so it meant that it was a good pay rate. And so even though he was concerned about his privacy in this situation, he was still compelled to trade it for the money that he really needed. And then at the same time, workers also use a lot of strategies to protect their privacy, but these can also be costly. So for example, crowd workers often come across really invasive questions. And when they do, they might abandon the task halfway. But then this ends up meaning that there's a lot of wasted time and effort. And on these kinds of platforms where you're only earning a few pennies to a couple dollars per task, time is really money. And then similarly, with ride sharing and with delivery drivers, they might constantly change their app settings or even delete the app when it's not in use. But not only is that really annoying to do, but you might miss out on lucrative offers, and because you just don't have the app open or you can't check it quickly without also then acquiescing to being tracked, which you don't want to do. And privacy protection can also be risky. And so, for example, say you're doing a survey and you respond to an invasive survey question that you don't want to do by typing in something like, this is against whichever company's terms of service. You end up running the risk of getting your work rejected, of being blocked by the platform. And if you're economically precarious and you really need the money, then that's a pretty big risk that you're running just to protect your privacy, just to protect it. And privacy protection is also really difficult, and this, we're all familiar with. Workers have very little information about their work compared to the customers in the platform. So they don't know often who the customer is, what the task involves, what it's for, how their data will be used. And sometimes they can answer some of this stuff by doing a Google search, but that takes time. And so in these cases, workers often can just get faced with an information request that they don't want to provide, and then end up being forced into this position where they have to choose between finishing the task or quitting it and losing all of that money. So something that is true across contexts is also that privacy protection can become easier over time. And so some workers become more skilled and efficient at working over time. And so by gaining more experience, by going online and learning tips and tricks, and this ends up meaning that they can become more discerning about the work that they complete. So for example, one worker that I spoke with had been doing gig work for 3 years as his main source of income, but he was able to become more discerning about the work that he does because he's satisfied with his earnings. But he also said that wasn't the way in the beginning. In the beginning, he was desperate. He would have done anything for a buck, in his words. And so this is a good thing for some workers, but it's also problematic because it means privacy is this privilege that only some people can access, like we talked about anonymity being a privilege. And so workers who aren't able to achieve these efficiencies, for example, workers who might be less tech savvy, they might not see these privacy gains, and they might end up getting lost in this sort of scenario. And then something that I find particularly interesting is that workers can also push back and co-opt surveillance strategies to protect themselves. And so workers often complain about customers that they dispute the work that they've done, or they give them a bad review when they don't deserve it, or the platforms don't track their work accurately. And all of these things negatively impact their earnings. And so to protect from a lot of these economic risks, workers can surveil themselves. And so they can record themselves and their activity to resolve these disputes, and also provide evidence of work that they've done. And so online in freelancing and crowd work, this might mean, again, a lot of work. So taking screenshots, saving websites, taking notes, and then a lot of drivers will use dash cams. And then in offline settings like ride sharing and delivery, there are also a lot of physical safety risks. So for example, safety is a really common concern among women who are ride sharing drivers. And so in these cases, having some form of tracking, even though it's problematic in other sort of scenarios, it can actually bring a sense of safety for drivers as well. And so in addition to using the app's tracking feature, workers can also use their own strategies to stay safe. So sharing their location with family using third-party location apps, or by using dash cams again. And this keeps them safe, but it also requires them to spend their own money just so that they can do their jobs safely, which can be problematic. And this applies in a lot of different contexts, where you think about conversations where the blame and the responsibilities just shifted onto the user themselves to protect themselves, which is just a huge amount of labor that they really shouldn't be shouldering. And so all of these findings led me to ask, what could privacy protective work platforms look like? And based on these findings, my co-authors and I developed a set of guiding questions that people can use to evaluate privacy on work platforms and to think about the design of future platforms. So the questions are organized around 4 main themes that stand out for being really crucial for worker privacy: transparency, necessity, and autonomy, and accountability. And let's look at a specific example to make this a little bit more real, see a couple of these questions at work. So the Upwork platform is a freelancing platform, and it tracks freelancers' work by taking a screenshot of their computers every 10 minutes. And it also logs their activity levels, including their mouse clicks and their keystrokes. And clients are able to view these data to assess workers' performance. And workers, because people do have a lot of sort of issues with the idea that their screens are constantly being recorded, they are able to delete these data. But then if they do that, then the work isn't included in their billing invoice. So there's always that trade-off. So some of the guiding questions I developed focus on data transparency. So to what extent workers can tell that they're being surveilled, by whom, and how the data are used. So in this case, workers can see that when screenshots are taking place and how these data are being accessed, and that these data are being accessed by clients. So that's pretty good. But then on the other hand, workers can't tell when these data have been accessed or exactly how they're used, both by the customers themselves and by the platforms. And so this ends up leading to a lot of uncertainty that then sort of impacts how workers can make decisions about their privacy and what they should have on their screens, and all of those types of sort of decisions, which can also create more privacy vulnerabilities. And then another set of guiding questions focuses on whether the data being collected are necessary for the work process. And what happens if these data are inaccurate? And so here there's again cause for concern because workers' keystrokes and clicks are used to assess whether they're active or inactive, and so then whether they should be paid or not. And so a green bar signals activity, and you'll see that there, and a gray bar signals inactivity. But just because a bar is gray, that doesn't mean that a worker isn't working. So we all know, like when you're working, you're not always constantly clicking on things. So sometimes you might be, thinking or reading what you've written or programmed or anything like that. And this can lead to clients making faulty inferences about a worker's activity, which can then impact their ability to get future jobs. And if they're economically precarious, that's also really problematic. And so applying these guiding questions to Upwork helps us see that platforms collect data that's too granular. It's not really well suited for the reason it's set up, which is assessing the work, and that there are a lot of negative consequences from these design choices as well. And so I'd like to end this deep dive into the gig economy by briefly considering a few high-level takeaways. So much of what I've presented on privacy in the gig economy has broader implications for thinking about and designing for privacy. So first, I talked about how privacy threats can come from platforms and from customers. And the source of threat really does impact how workers respond, how they feel about the threat itself, and the degree to which they can respond. And so both in the gig economy and in other contexts, one really needs to consider the network of threats, multiple sources of threats. So for example, on social media, this means not just looking at the platform itself, but also the behaviors of other users. So sometimes people might not actually be concerned about the company itself, but more so about wanting better controls to keep certain disclosures private from other people. So for example, if you're thinking, if you think about being, having a stigmatized identity, or like maybe being, LGBTQ+, you might not care as much about Facebook per se, knowing that you're gay, but you may not want a homophobic family member to know that, or vice versa. And then second, in the gig economy context, workers can feel really compelled to trade privacy for income, for money that they really depend on. But this is also the case for a lot of other settings. So a lot of my work also looks at how people with disabilities and other stigmatized identities end up disclosing really sensitive information about themselves on social media because they need social support. And all of that happens as a very rational decision that, you need this, this support. So even though you have very well-founded privacy concerns, you may end up discounting them anyway. And what I say here is, this shouldn't have to be this trade-off. We often hear about this dichotomy that you need to either have privacy or you need to have security, but you can't have both. And that really is a false dichotomy, and design choices can remove these trade-offs by supporting people being private, but then just giving them more control so that they can make more sort of empowered decisions about how and when and who to whom they disclose. And then finally, protecting against privacy risks and other risks is difficult and it's costly. And this really highlights the need to make it easier for people to make privacy decisions, such as by increasing transparency or control, like I mentioned with the questions. And that's where some of those guiding questions that I discussed can be helpful. And just broadly, I think it's important to bear in mind, and we've talked about this in the discussion, that privacy is also a privilege, and we have to make sure that these privacy risks don't end up falling to marginalized groups or people who may not have the right tools to be able to protect against the privacy harms that they face. And so with that, I'd like to say thanks for attending this talk and learning more about the gig economy with me. And I'd love to connect, hear how people are thinking here about these issues in their own context. Feel free to email me. And yeah, I'm excited to chat more.